The town of Black Hollow was cloaked in silence, a suffocating kind of stillness that gnawed at the edges of sanity. It wasn't always like this. There had been life once. Laughter ringing through the cobblestone streets, the hum of a bustling market, and children's chatter spilling from the schoolyard. But now, the streets stood empty, the windows darkened, and the air carried an oppressive weight, as though the town itself were holding its breath. At the center of this desolation sat a mansion, old, grotesque, and alive in ways that stone and timber should never be. It wasn't just a house. It was an entity, a predator lurking at the edge of awareness. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones, their voices trembling as they spoke of the hunger of an ancient evil that lived within the walls, waiting, watching, choosing its next victim. For decades, the mansion had loomed over Black Hollow like a rotting tooth. Generations had been born and buried in its shadow, each warned to never step past its rusted iron gates. But warnings had a way of fading, of becoming stories to frighten disobedient children. It wasn't long before curiosity began to stir in restless hearts. It started with the disappearance of a stray dog, just a mutt no one cared much about. Then a hunter vanished while tracking deer near the mansion grounds. Search parties found his gun shattered in two and his boots filled with blood, but nobody. By the time children began disappearing, their laughter replaced by hollow echoes, the town had already succumbed to its fear. The evil that waits was not a mindless beast. It was clever, calculating, and patient. It fed on fear, drinking deeply from the terror that seeped into every crack of Black Hollow. The mansion was its lair, and it used its decayed beauty to lure the brave, the foolish, and the desperate into its clutches. Among the townsfolk, only one dared to speak openly about it. Edith Crowley, the town's oldest resident, had lived long enough to see the mansion claim more lives than she could count. "It's not just a house," she would say, her voice trembling with age and dread. "It's a prison for something that should have stayed buried." One cold October night, a group of teenagers, jaded by Edith's tales and emboldened by too much whiskey, decided to test their courage. Armed with flashlights, phones, and a handful of crude weapons, they slipped past the iron gates, their laughter cutting through the heavy silence. The mansion welcomed them like an old friend. Its doors creaked open without resistance, the air inside heavy with rot and despair. The teenagers moved cautiously, their bravado quickly dissolving into uneasy silence as they ventured deeper into the house. The walls seemed to close in around them, whispering secrets they couldn't quite hear. Then came the first scream. It was high-pitched, guttural, and inhuman. It came from Rebecca, the bravest of the group. She had wandered ahead, her flashlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. When the others found her, she was frozen, her eyes locked on the floor. There, in the dust, was a hand, not severed or decayed, but alive, its fingers twitching and clawing at the floor as though trying to pull itself free from the abyss below. Before anyone could react, the hand shot up, its fingers elongating unnaturally as it latched onto Rebecca's ankle. Her scream died in her throat as she was yanked downward, the floorboard splintering and swallowing her whole. The others ran, their footsteps pounding against the creaking floor as the house came alive around them. Shadows writhed along the walls, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. The air grew colder with each step, their breath fogging as they stumbled blindly through the labyrinthine halls. But the mansion was no mere structure. It was alive, and it was hungry. As the survivors tried to escape, they found the front door sealed shut, its wood pulsating like flesh. The windows, once broken and empty, now showed nothing but endless darkness, as though the house had swallowed the outside world whole. And in the distance, echoing through the endless halls, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and growing closer with every passing second. Whatever lived in the mansion was coming, and it would not let them leave. The footsteps echoed louder, heavy and deliberate, as if the house itself amplified the sound to torment them. The group huddled together, their flashlights trembling in their hands. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, every inhale thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls seemed to pulse, like a living thing exhaling in anticipation. Mark, the self-proclaimed leader of the group, forced himself to speak. "We stick together," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "Whatever this is, we'll find a way out. We have to." But even as he said it, the house seemed to mock him. A low, guttural groan reverberated through the floorboards, and the walls creaked, shifting ever so slightly. It was as though the mansion was alive and listening, savoring their terror like a fine wine. Behind them, the hallway stretched unnaturally, the shadows deepening until the corridor seemed to fade into an infinite void. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on them like a weight. Then came the sound, a wet, dragging noise, as if something slick and heavy was being pulled across the floor. "Run," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. Without another word, they bolted, their flashlights bouncing erratically as they sprinted down the corridor. But the mansion was a maze, its halls twisting and bending in impossible ways. Every door they tried was locked, the handles cold and unyielding. They stumbled into a large room, gasping for breath. The air inside was thick and stifling, the faint scent of iron hanging in the air. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated in a dark, viscous substance that dripped slowly onto the rotting carpet below. What is this place?" whispered Jenna, her wide eyes darting to every shadow. The room was filled with strange artifacts, cracked mirrors that reflected nothing, paintings of faceless figures with black, hollow eyes, and a grand piano with keys that seemed to be made of bone. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay an open book. The pages were blank, but the edges were frayed and stained with what looked like dried blood. Mark hesitated, his curiosity warring with his terror. "Maybe there's something here, something that can help us." "No," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "Don't touch anything. This place, it's not normal. Everything here is wrong." But Mark was already reaching for the book. The moment his fingers brushed the pages, the room shuddered violently. The chandelier swung wildly, its crystals clinking together in a discordant melody. The paintings began to bleed, thick black liquid oozing from the canvas and pooling on the floor. And then the book moved. It slammed shut with a deafening clap, and a deep, guttural voice filled the room, speaking in a language none of them could understand. The voice was everywhere, above them, beneath them, inside them, its words vibrating through their very bones. Mark stumbled back, clutching his head. His nose began to bleed, and his eyes rolled back in his head as he collapsed to the floor. "Mark!" Jenna screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. His body convulsed violently, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles. "Get away from him!" Sarah shouted, yanking Jenna back just as Mark's eyes snapped open. They weren't his eyes anymore. The whites had turned black, and his pupils glowed with a sickly yellow light. His lips curled into a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that had sharpened into jagged points. He stood slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. "Mark!" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his head tilting unnaturally to the side. "He's gone," the thing that was once Mark said, its voice a guttural rasp. "This body is mine now." It lunged at them, its movements impossibly fast. Sarah grabbed Jenna and pulled her away, narrowly avoiding Mark's clawed hands. They fled through the nearest door, slamming it shut behind them. The hallway beyond was different now. The walls were covered in what looked like flesh, pulsating and oozing dark fluid. The floor squelched beneath their feet, and the air was filled with a low, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of a giant beast. "We are not getting out of here," Jenna sobbed, her tears mixing with the blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. "Yes, we are," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. "We have to keep moving." They stumbled through the endless corridors, the house shifting and twisting around them. Every so often, they heard Mark's laughter echoing through the halls, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down their spines. Eventually, they found themselves in what appeared to be a dining room. The long table was set for a feast, but the plates were piled high with rotting meat, the stench so overwhelming that Jenna gagged. At the head of the table sat a figure, a man dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Welcome," the figure said, his voice a smooth, velvety purr. "You've made it farther than most." Sarah stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "What do you want from us?" The man chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "Want? Oh, my dear, it's not about what I want. It's about what it wants." He gestured to the surrounding walls, which seemed to shudder in response. Who are you?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. The man tilted his head, revealing eyes that glowed with the same sickly yellow light as Mark's. "I am nothing but a servant," he said. "A servant to the hunger that waits. And now, so are you?" The chandelier above them flickered, and the shadows in the room began to move, stretching toward them like grasping hands. And then, the lights went out. Darkness enveloped them entirely, so thick and absolute it felt like drowning. Jenna screamed, her voice sharp and desperate, only to be abruptly cut off. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the wet, slithering sound of something moving in the black void. "Jenna!" Sarah's voice trembled, her hands flailing blindly as she searched for her friend. The air felt cold and damp, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to writhe, as though alive. "Sarah!" Jenna's voice was faint, distant. It sounded wrong, thin and strained, as if it were being pulled from her throat against her will. A light flickered. Just for a moment, Sarah's flashlight sputtered back to life, its weak beam slicing through the darkness. She spun it toward the source of Jenna's voice, and froze. Jenna stood at the far end of the room, her back turned to Sarah. Around her, the shadows coiled and writhed, moving like living smoke. Her head twitched unnaturally, snapping from one side to the other as if struggling against some invisible force. "Jenna!" Sarah called, her voice breaking. Slowly, Jenna turned. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. But her expression was not her own. It was stretched into a ghastly smile, too wide for her face, her lips splitting and bleeding at the edges. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her fingers twitched spasmodically. "Jenna?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now, her body paralyzed with fear. Jenna's mouth moved, but the voice that emerged was not hers. It was deep, guttural, and laced with malice. "She's not here anymore." Before Sarah could react, the shadows surged forward, swallowing Jenna whole. The room trembled, the walls groaning as cracks spread like veins across their surface. The flashlight flickered and died again, plunging Sarah into darkness once more. "No, no, no, no." Sarah stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could hear the sound of something wet and heavy dragging itself across the floor, circling her like a predator. And then she ran. She didn't know where she was going. There was no direction, no sense of time or space in this hellish place. The mansion twisted around her, its corridors narrowing and widening at will, the doors shifting and disappearing before her eyes. Her only focus was on putting as much distance as possible between herself and whatever had taken Jenna. She burst through a doorway and found herself in a vast, empty hall. The ceiling was impossibly high, disappearing into darkness, and the walls were lined with mirrors. But these weren't ordinary mirrors. They reflected not her own image, but distorted, grotesque versions of herself. In one, her face was hollow, her eyes sunken and lifeless. In another, her skin was charred and blackened, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. As she stumbled forward, the reflections began to move, twisting and writhing independent of her. They pressed against the glass, their mouths opening wide as if screaming, though no sound emerged. "Help me!" The voice was soft, almost a whisper, and it came from one of the mirrors. Sarah turned, her eyes locking onto the reflection of a young boy, no older than 10. His face was streaked with tears, his hands pressed against the glass as though trying to push through. "Please," he begged. "Don't leave me here." Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. "Who are you? How do I get out of here?" The boy's expression twisted into one of terror. "You can't," he said, his voice cracking. "It won't let you." Before Sarah could respond, the boy's face contorted, his mouth opening unnaturally wide. Black tendrils erupted from his throat, slamming against the inside of the glass. The mirror shattered, and the shards flew towards Sarah like knives. She ducked, feeling the sharp sting of glass slicing her cheek. The hall began to collapse. The mirrors exploded one by one, their fragments swirling into a vortex of shadow and light. The ground beneath Sarah's feet cracked and buckled, and she felt herself falling, the air rushing past her in a deafening roar. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. Groaning, she rolled onto her side, her body aching. She was in a basement, or what looked like one. The walls were made of crumbling stone, slick with moisture and covered in pulsating black veins. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the floor was littered with bones, some of them human. In the center of the room stood an altar, carved from obsidian and covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when she looked at them. Above it hung a figure, a man, or what was left of him. His body was suspended by thick, black tendrils that pierced his flesh, his eyes lifeless and his mouth agape in a silent scream. As Sarah approached, the man's eyes snapped open, glowing with the same sickly yellow light she had seen in Mark. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "I didn't want to," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I just want to leave. Please, let me go." The man chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "There is no leaving. It hungers, and you are its feast." The tendrils holding him began to move, slithering towards Sarah. She backed away, her heart pounding, but the room offered no escape. The walls closed in, the black veins spreading and writhing like snakes. And then she saw it. At the far end of the room, hidden in the shadows, was a doorway. It was small and unassuming, barely visible against the dark stone. But it called to her, a faint glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, Sarah ran. The tendrils lashed out, scraping her arms and legs as she darted past the altar. The man's laughter followed her, echoing in her ears as she reached the door. She threw it open and stumbled through, slamming it shut behind her. But what lay beyond was not freedom. It was worse. Sarah pressed her back against the door, gasping for air. Her body trembled, her arms and legs slick with blood from the scratches left by the tendrils. The room she had stumbled into was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. She turned her flashlight back on, its weak beam revealing a narrow, circular chamber. The walls were made of the same fleshy material as the mansion, pulsating gently as though breathing. In the center of the room stood a figure, a woman, draped in tattered black robes that billowed as if moved by an unseen wind. The woman's face was obscured by a veil, but her presence radiated malice. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, as though waiting. Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, the movement slow and deliberate. Then, in a voice that was both many and one, she spoke. "You have come far, little moth, but this is where your flame dies." The door behind Sarah vanished, melting into the wall as if it had never been there. She was trapped. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her flashlight flickering. "What do you want from me?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising with desperation. The woman raised a hand, and the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the pulsating veins spreading and growing thicker. From the darkness emerged figures, twisted, grotesque shapes that once might have been human. Their bodies were broken and malformed, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. "They were like you," the woman said, her voice dripping with contempt, "foolish enough to believe they could escape. But this place does not let go. It consumes. It transforms." The figures advanced, their movement slow but relentless. Sarah's flashlight flickered and died completely, plunging the room into darkness. She backed away until her hands brushed against the cold stone altar in the center of the chamber. "Please," Sarah begged, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to die here." The woman's veil fluttered, revealing a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were empty voids, and her mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "This is not death, child. This is eternity." The figures lunged. Sarah screamed and swung her flashlight wildly, the metal cracking against bone and flesh. But for every creature she struck down, two more emerged from the shadows. Their hands clawed at her, pulling her toward the altar. "No," she cried, thrashing against their grip. As she struggled, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic, a dagger, ornate and ancient, lying atop the altar. Without thinking, she grabbed it and drove it into the nearest figure. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, its body convulsing before crumbling into ash. The other figures hesitated, their movements faltering. The woman hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "You dare defy me?" Sarah's grip on the dagger tightened. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she realized the blade was her only chance. She swung it wildly, the weapon cutting through the air and striking down the creatures one by one. The woman stepped forward, her form growing taller and more imposing with each step. The chamber shook, cracks spreading across the walls as the mansion itself seemed to roar in anger. "You cannot win," the woman snarled. "You are nothing." But Sarah didn't stop. She lunged at the woman, the dagger aimed straight for her heart. The blade plunged into her chest, and the woman let out a deafening scream, her body collapsing into a writhing mass of shadows. The chamber began to collapse. The walls crumbled, and the floor split open, revealing a yawning abyss below. Sarah stumbled back, the ground beneath her feet threatening to give way. And then she saw it, a faint light in the distance, shining through the darkness like a beacon. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she ran toward it, leaping over the cracks and debris. The light grew brighter, blinding her as she reached for it. And then, silence. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying on the ground outside the mansion. The sky above her was gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. She could hear the sound of birds chirping faintly in the distance, a sound she hadn't realized she missed. She sat up slowly, her body aching but whole. The mansion loomed behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. It looked abandoned, as though it had been untouched for decades. But Sarah knew better. She turned away, her legs trembling as she began to walk. The town of Black Hollow was in the distance, its streets still and empty. As she reached the edge of the mansion's grounds, she hesitated, glancing back one last time. The front door creaked open ever so slightly, and a faint, guttural whisper reached her ears. "Come back." Sarah turned and ran, vowing never to look back again. But deep down, she knew the truth. The evil still waited, patient and hungry. And one day, it would call for her again.